Imagine waking up tomorrow without your phone. No alarm, no electricity, no office, no school, no supermarket. You open your eyes beside a small fire. Outside, there are no roads, no buildings, and no cars. There is only the landscape, and somewhere inside that landscape is everything you need to survive. Food, water, fuel, shelter. You have no idea exactly what you will eat tonight. You only know that you have to find something. This was normal for most of human history. 20,000 years ago, your morning could begin with the same question that had confronted humans for hundreds of thousands of years. What are we going to eat today? You might imagine that the answer required non-stop hunting, running after animals, walking for hours, fighting predators, searching desperately for food until sunset. But archaeological evidence gives you a much stranger picture. Your ancestors worked hard, but they did not necessarily work all day. They also rested, they talked, they cared for children, they made tools, they processed food, they watched the landscape, they learned, and sometimes, they simply waited. To understand this, you can look at the Hadza of northern Tanzania. The Hadza are a modern hunter-gatherer society. They are not ancient humans frozen in time, but their traditional way of life gives researchers a rare opportunity to study how humans can organize daily life when food still has to be obtained directly from nature. In 2015, anthropologist Herman Poncer and his colleagues studied 41 Hadza adults. They used GPS devices and activity monitors to measure how much people actually moved during ordinary days. The results challenged a simple assumption. Yes, the Hadza were physically active. They walked, they hunted, they gathered, they collected water and firewood. But their day was not one continuous period of movement. There were long periods when people were inactive. And that makes sense. Your body needs energy to move. Every kilometer costs calories. Every hunt costs energy. Every difficult climb costs energy. When food is uncertain, wasting energy can be dangerous. So your ancestors had to make a calculation without ever using a calculator. Move when movement is useful. Stop when movement is not necessary. That means your prehistoric day probably had a rhythm. Search, move, stop, eat, rest, move again, and return. Finding food itself could also take many forms. At Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania, archaeological layers dating back roughly 1.8 million years contain stone tools and animal remains associated with early human activity. Finding an animal was only the beginning. The meat had to be processed, bones had to be opened, useful parts had to be separated, food had to be carried, and sometimes it had to be shared. A successful hunt could create hours of work after the animal was already dead. So your ancestor did not simply spend the day hunting. They spent part of the day preparing the results of hunting. The same was true for gathering. A plant found in the landscape had to be recognized, collected, carried, processed, and sometimes cooked. The prehistoric day was therefore not divided into neat categories. There was no separate job called food. Food was connected to walking, searching, cooking, carrying, remembering and teaching. And teaching was especially important, because a prehistoric child did not go to school for 8 hours every day. A child learned by watching people. A study of Hadza children examined approximately 15,000 hourly observations from 76 individuals. Researchers recorded activities including playing, walking, eating, food collection, childcare, tool maintenance, water collection and gathering firewood. Learning was mixed into ordinary life. A young child could watch an adult prepare food, then try to copy the movement. They could watch someone make a tool, then attempt it themselves. They could follow older children through the landscape. Slowly, they learned which plants were safe, which places had water, which animals were dangerous, which paths were useful, and which places should be avoided. The landscape became a classroom, but there was no teacher standing in front of it. Your teacher was everyone around you, and your memory became part of your survival equipment. Imagine knowing a valley where water remained after several days without rain. Imagine knowing where animals usually passed. Imagine knowing which plants appeared during a particular season. You did not need Google Maps. You carried a map inside your memory, and that map could take decades to build. An experienced hunter could recognize tracks that a child had never noticed. An experienced gatherer could identify a plant from a few leaves. An older person could remember what happened during previous droughts. Knowledge accumulated, then it moved from one generation to another. But your ancestors did not spend every moment outside. A huge part of the day happened around camp. And archaeological sites give you clues about what that meant. At Blombos Cave in South Africa, humans were living around 100,000 years ago. Archaeologists have found stone tools, animal remains, shellfish and evidence of repeated occupation. But around 75,000 years ago, people at Blombos were also making perforated shell beads. Dozens of shells were deliberately modified. Think about that. You do not need a shell bead to kill an animal. You do not need one to collect water. You do not need one to survive a cold night. Someone still spent time making them. Then, in 2018, researchers led by archaeologist Christopher Henshelwood reported an engraved piece of ochre from Blombos Cave. It dates to around 73,000 years ago. The surface contains a deliberate crosshatched pattern. You cannot know exactly what the mark meant, but you know someone made it intentionally. That means your ancestors had time for activities that were not directly connected to finding their next meal. They were creating, communicating, experimenting, and perhaps simply making something because another human might understand it. That changes the image of the prehistoric day. Your ancestors were not machines designed only to survive. They were social humans. And social life takes time. At Klasies River in South Africa, humans repeatedly occupied caves and shelters during the Middle and later Stone Age. Archaeologists have found evidence of hunting, shellfish collection, stone tools and food processing. Imagine an evening there. The food has been prepared. The fire is burning. Children are nearby. Someone is repairing a tool. Someone is preparing food. Someone is watching the fire. Someone is talking. There is no television, no social media, no artificial light covering the horizon. The darkness itself changes the rhythm of the day. And this is where your modern idea of productivity begins to break apart. You measure your day by tasks. How much work you finished. How many messages you answered. How many hours you spent at your desk. Your ancestor had no such measurement. If the food was secured. If the water was collected. If the fire was ready. If the children were safe. If the tools were working. There might be no urgent task left. So you could sit. You could talk. You could watch. You could rest. And rest was not necessarily wasted time. Your body had to recover. Tomorrow would require movement again. The Hadza research also shows substantial periods of inactivity during ordinary days. A 2023 study involving 136 Hadza adults found roughly 11 to 12 hours per day classified as inactive, depending on sex and measurement. But this did not mean sitting motionless in a modern chair. People could squat, kneel, stand, prepare food, talk, or rest around a fire. Their inactivity was part of an active lifestyle. This creates a strange contrast with your world. You can spend 10 hours sitting and still feel exhausted. Your ancestor could spend hours resting and still have a physically demanding day. Because the important question was never simply how long you were moving. It was whether you moved when movement mattered. And then there was walking. A lot of walking. But your ancestors were not walking for exercise. They were walking because something they needed was somewhere else. Food, water, firewood, a hunting location, another group, a seasonal resource. Movement had a purpose. Today, you can travel several kilometers without moving your body. You can order food from another neighborhood. You can speak to someone on another continent. You can find a location instantly on a map. Your ancestor had none of this. Distance was physical. Information was physical. Food was physical. If you wanted something, you usually had to go there. And when you arrived, you had to remember how to return. So what did ancient humans actually do all day? They searched, they walked, they gathered, they hunted, they cooked, they ate, they repaired, they carried, they watched, they taught, they cared for children, they talked, they rested, and they slept. But there is something deeper hidden inside this ordinary routine. Your ancestors did not divide life into the categories you use today. There was no clear line between work and education, no clear line between exercise and transportation, no clear line between family time and survival. Walking was transportation. It was also exercise. Cooking was survival. It was also social time. Playing was entertainment. It could also teach skills. Watching an adult was observation. It was also education. Almost everything had multiple purposes. And perhaps that is the real answer to the question. What did ancient humans do all day? They lived, not in short, separated blocks of work, entertainment and rest, but in one continuous rhythm. They searched for what they needed. They learned from what happened. They remembered what worked. They taught it to someone younger. They rested when movement was unnecessary. And when darkness arrived, they gathered around the fire. Tomorrow, they would do it again. For thousands of generations, this rhythm continued. Then the world changed. Agriculture appeared. Permanent settlements grew. Cities eventually emerged. Clocks became common. Factories arrived. Offices arrived. Screens arrived. And your day became divided into increasingly smaller pieces. But your brain was shaped long before any of them existed. It was shaped by landscapes. By walking, by watching, by remembering, by learning from other humans, by sitting beside a fire when there was nothing urgent left to do. So when you imagine an ancient human waking up 20,000 years ago, do not imagine someone spending every minute fighting for survival. Imagine something quieter. A person waking beside a fire, looking outside, checking the weather, talking to the people around them, deciding where to go, walking toward food, returning home, eating, resting, teaching a child, repairing a tool, watching the sun disappear, and eventually sleeping. It sounds simple. But that simple rhythm continued for an almost unimaginable length of time, and somewhere inside those ordinary days, the human mind you carry today was being shaped. The world around you has changed completely, but the rhythm underneath it is ancient. You wake, you search, you learn, you eat, you connect, you rest, you sleep, and perhaps the strangest thing about your ordinary day is this: you are still living inside a pattern that began long before anyone knew what a clock was.